I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Jake.
I'm Rosie.
And this is our podcast on Quantum Leap, which aired in the United States of America between 1989 and 1993 in 5 seasons. I'm not sure exactly when BBC Two got hold of it, but they were only on season 2 by early 1992, which is when I picked it up. And then Rosie started watching it too a little later that year. And it was something our mum was watching in the middle of the night and found it easier to let us join in with than try to make us go to bed. And it was also something we both got into and enjoyed quite a lot. And I think they must have shown seasons 2, 3, 4, 5 on BBC Two quite quickly over the next couple of years. Quantum Leap is a show which, like Time Busters, is about going back in time to put right what once went wrong. Although, unlike Time Busters, Quantum Leap doesn't have time vandals going back in time to screw things up, at least not until the 5th season. And we have mentioned Quantum Leap on podcast before to compare it to The Incredible Hulk, which I'm sure inspired the show in a lot of ways. And I expect creator and executive producer and writer of some important episodes, Donald P. Bellisario, wouldn't mind admitting that he'd been inspired a lot by the feel of The Incredible Hulk when thinking up Quantum Leap. And indeed, there are some individual episodes of Quantum Leap that owe quite a lot to some episodes of The Incredible Hulk. As I'm sure we mentioned on the Incredible Hulk podcast, it's really the kind of nomadic, altruistic lifestyle of the main protagonist that gives the two shows such a similar feel. A different location, a whole different guest cast every week, with a problem for the hero, who is a physician and a scientist in both cases, to sort out and then move on to the next one in the next episode.
When we started getting those DVDs of The Incredible Hulk, on which we built our podcast, I hadn't seen Quantum Leap for quite a long time. I don't think Jake had either. I was watching The Incredible Hulk and thinking, well, this is good, but I think Quantum Leap is probably better because of my memories of it and how much I'd got into certain episodes as a child. And then I watched some episodes of Quantum Leap when they came on the Sci-Fi Channel, and some of them were absolute codswallop. And I thought, well, I guess maybe Quantum Leap has higher peaks and lower troughs than The Incredible Hulk, because I think not only are some episodes of Quantum Leap very much better than this, I'm pretty sure they are actually better than The Incredible Hulk as well. And then when I got the DVD set of Quantum Leap, I found out I was right about that, but I really had no idea of how low and how many the troughs of Quantum Leap were, and the peaks are not nearly so many, I'm afraid, and then there are a number of average episodes that are probably about the same as The Incredible Hulk. And we were saying, weren't we, in the case of The Incredible Hulk, there's really only one episode that you see it's coming up and you go, oh God, no! And that's the film noir detective Who Framed Roger Rabbit parody sort of episode, of which Quantum Leap has one, and we also go, oh God, no, when we see it's that one coming up, and many, many others, including all or almost all of those very important episodes, usually, if not always, season openers and finales by Donald himself.
Yes, sitting and watching The Incredible Hulk all the way through is a fine and easy experience, and even the very worst episodes aren't at all bad, except, you say, that film noir one. Even the shortened season 5 episodes of The Incredible Hulk are a lot better than most of Quantum Leap. The BBC did repeat a few bits of Quantum Leap in the late 90s. Sometimes in the middle of the night they had some episodes there that got recorded and watched the next morning. They had a phase during 1999 of showing some on weekend lunchtimes. And there were a few weeks where the three of us, who I've mentioned, watched it before, sat and had our lunch with it and quite enjoyed it. And we got to see some earlier episodes there that we hadn't seen. A couple from season 1 and from early season 2 that I think the BBC had handpicked to put on at lunchtime. Certainly the Jimmy episode was a good choice to have on there, as we were very interested to see that one, and that's the one I specifically remember watching at a weekend lunchtime, which I think it's worth mentioning now has a lot to thank the Ricky episode of The Incredible Hulk for, and indeed we have compared those two episodes specifically on the Incredible Hulk podcast. Often, if Quantum Leap had been recorded in the middle of the night, actually sitting down and watching it proved to be a rather disappointing experience. I remember sitting down to watch the season 5 one, and I was thinking, okay, Sam's doing this college thing, this Daredevil stuff. We didn't like all that stuff at all when we were watching the DVDs quite recently, but at the time I was finding it quite innocuous. Okay, average episode, Sam's a college student, he's going to sort out these stupid hazing rituals. But then suddenly, oh no, it's an Evil Leaper episode. I don't want to see that.
This time around, I found the Evil Leaper more interesting than any of that college stuff, but we'll go into more detail about that later and why it's not as interesting as it ought to be.
And then, yes, as you say, we did both see some bits on the Sci-Fi Channel in this century, but it was really your DVDs that have helped us to come to grips with Quantum Leap and lose 90% of our enthusiasm for it, and then make this podcast.
Really, everything good about it in some way comes from the two cast members, who we like to call Scott and Al. Scott Bakula as Dr. Sam Beckett and Dean Stockwell as Al Calavici. And we think it's funny to call them Scott and Al because there's some guy on a special feature on the DVD saying that when the show was cancelled, people protested and demanded that it come back by standing outside the studios shouting, "Bring back Scott, bring back Al." And they're both absolutely fabulous. And in a very, very bad episode, they might manage to get some humour or some compelling little speeches or something, if there is any to be had. In an average episode, they can really make the most of it, and in a good episode, they've got what it takes to really carry it from beginning to end and bring out all the potential.
I always liked Al, even when I was 8 or 9, because he was funny. I also liked the fact that he was a hologram, and unlike on Red Dwarf, Quantum Leap actually bothers, or perhaps has the budget, to do some fun hologram effects in every episode. What I don't like now, and I don't think you do either, is all the sexual perversion humour they get out of Al. One of the DVD boxes describes him as lecherous hologram Al Calavici, which I thought was quite a good description. Certainly better than another DVD which calls him a wisecracking holograph, which is not untrue either. But certainly a lot of the lecherous Al humour you wouldn't get away with nowadays, and rightly so, because very inappropriate. What is Al's cut-off age for perving on girls, or thinking they're sweet and wanting them to be his daughter? Well, it's actually 16, isn't it? He'll perv on absolutely everyone 16 or over.
A couple of times you can spot where they've dubbed something over that doesn't match the lips, and one of those things was that Al was perving on a girl and Sam was saying she's 17, but his lips were saying she's 15. You can't do that, and I guess they realised just in time.
And they're both ridiculous ages for her anyway. She was supposed to be a college freshman, and she looked perfectly well like a college freshman. I could believe she was 18, 19 years old, but then they have to go and say she's younger. But yeah, apparently one of the things Al discovers during the course of the show, his journey, is that he would like to have a daughter, and of course in the end he ends up with 4 daughters, thanks to a rewritten timeline. And really on paper the lecherous hologram aspect is the main trait of Al, but fortunately Dean Stockwell brings a lot more to the role. One thing he does that I've always been very grateful for is what Chris Barry can't ever be bothered to do, in that he does the hologram acting properly, carefully, and believably, which is very important for achieving the illusion of the world that the show is presenting to us. being a hologram, Al can't interact physically with any of the other characters, with the world that Sam is in. Of course, in the story, in the setup, Al isn't really there. He's in the imaging chamber in the future. So Dean Stockwell has quite a job to do to make Al a tangible part of the show, and he does that so well by involving Al emotionally in the adventure with Sam, creating Sam and Al's relationship, friendship. Of course, that's something that Scott and Al do together. One of the problems with the early episodes was that Al really seemed kind of detached emotionally from what Sam was doing, what was going on in the story, what the characters back in time were doing. And there's an episode late in season 1, which I think is a turning point for the show in many ways, the Ms. Melanie episode, where someone realises, well, Al's not physically in the story, so he has to be involved with what the characters are doing and really care about Ms. Melanie and really get into the story and care about the issues like the civil rights, and thus he'll be part of the show in that way. And that worked really well there, and Dean continued very successfully to give Al the right emotional anchor in the show, make him care about the characters, care about Sam, and be emotionally invested.
Up to then, every episode, I think they have him going on about something that's happening in his present, the future of the world that we're seeing. His neighbours are keeping him awake with their noise. There's an episode which has an early appearance by Terry Hatcher, in which Sam reveals that in his past, but Terry Hatcher's future, she didn't turn up at their wedding, Terry Hatcher's character's wedding to Sam. Her name is Donna. And he does what you're not really supposed to do at all and changes her future in the hope that she'll marry him after all, and it turns out that's the case, and we might come back to that whole thing. But it also fits in with the point I was making about Al having things going on in his life that we can't see and aren't interested in, because in that one he's got the government pestering him and pestering the project and trying to stop Sam from changing the future and trying to stop Al giving him information, which is something that recurs just the once in season 2, I think, the season 2 opener, one of those ones by Donald himself. There's this whole thing about whether the project is going to get more funding and whether what Sam is doing is worthwhile. And it's just not interesting. It's annoying because it interferes with and eclipses even what is interesting, which is Sam sorting out people's lives week by week.
It's quite a relief when watching it through, when you get to early season 2 and they do step away from trying to incorporate the present or the future, Sam's home time, where Al appears from, into the show, because it just doesn't work very well. They do come back to it later, kind of unavoidably, when Sam and Al swap places as Leaper and Hologram in the season 4 premiere, and I liked that when it was first on. It was a bit different. I hadn't seen the early ones. We got to see what was going on at Project Quantum Leap and meet Ziggy the computer and various people who were working there, and find out that Donna had indeed married Sam in the new timeline. But then they do keep coming back to Project Quantum Leap as a setting quite a bit, particularly in season 5. Quite a lot of scenes in the waiting room with Al talking to the people who've been leapt into. I think 3 different appearances in season 5 from Dennis Wolfberger's Gushy, whose name you hear mentioned in probably every episode of Quantum Leap, being yelled at by Al to move his image into various places to help Sam. And I think season 5 does get rather desperate for ideas in a lot of ways, and that's one symptom of it. Too many scenes set at Project Quantum Leap. But season 5 really is a mixed bag, because I'm thinking of another scene from season 5, one of the good season 5 episodes, the one where Sam is the war veteran who doesn't have any legs, where Al sums up perfectly what works about the whole show when he's talking to the paralysed soldier who's thinking of killing himself. The paralysed soldier can't hear him, but we can hear Al and appreciate what he's saying. After all his naval combat and being a prisoner of war in Vietnam, Al has a lot of particular sympathy for soldiers and wounded soldiers and people who've been scarred physically and emotionally by war, and Dean Stockwell brings that out extremely well, and he's urging the paralysed soldier to try and cling on to the will to live. I suppose you don't think anyone cares, it's just not true. Sam cares, and I care, and whatever force is bouncing us around in time cares. And that sums up perfectly what works about the show. Things in the past aren't as good as they should be. Sam and Al turn up there like a couple of angels to sort it out, and they care about the characters and making their lives better, be it by saving their lives, or making sure they don't end up married to the wrong people, or giving them better careers, or stopping them getting sexually harassed, or having to live in mental institutions when they don't need to, and that sort of thing. And if Sam and Al are going through caring about that, doing their best to achieve those ends, we care about it too and engage with the show.
This reminds me of one of my objections to modern things that were not made in the olden days, particularly movies. Characters' motivation has to be that something has happened extremely personally to one of them. For instance, Brad Pitt won't help get rid of the zombies because he thinks it's a good idea to get rid of zombies. He'll only do it because if he doesn't, his family won't have a safe place on this ship. That's as far as I can remember World War Z, anyway.
I thought a particularly bad one was a Dracula movie we watched, which wasn't a bad movie, where Dracula as Prince Vlad wouldn't go and stand up to the Huns or whatever it is until they recruited his own son for their child army. And I thought, come on, he's the prince of this country. It should be more than enough that he wants to go and stand up and fight for his people. That would be a much more compelling character.
And Suffragette, the protagonist, isn't interested in voting herself or other women having a vote until her husband lawfully takes her child away from her. She wouldn't care that that's happening to other women. Whereas Sam and Al want women to have the vote and all kinds of equal opportunities, and they want black and minority ethnic people to have their civil rights, and they want everybody to be equal and happy because they care about people. They don't just care about themselves like Dracula and the Brad Pitt character and the Suffragette character. And one of the mistakes that I think we're going to be listing here and there throughout the podcast is having them be personally involved. It's particularly an early mistake, and particularly by a writer called Paul Brown. In season 1, he's creating parallels between Sam's life and the life that he's leapt into. There's the episode called Kamikaze Kid, which is a very peculiar kind of mishmash of what I'm describing and a Grease movie parody kind of thing, and potentially a very good episode that has some good moments. Sam has to stop his, or the person he's leapt into's, older sister from marrying an abusive man. And so he turns around and says to Al, oh, I have to stop her marrying him because my sister Katie's first husband abusive, and that's why I care. But that's not right at all. Sam cares because he cares. And then the other early one I'm thinking of that's very like that is the one where Sam is a stunt man, and he's got a father who's a stunt man and a younger brother who the father wants to be a stunt man and he wants to be a musician, and he has to talk a lot of rubbish about his own older brother and go, oh, now I know why Tom convinced me not to play basketball like him, but to do my own thing, and I'm the big brother now. And it's just annoying having that in the episode. It's so unnecessary. And I guess by season 2, someone told Paul Brown, don't do that. Although there are still certain episodes in which Sam will be personally invested. There are 2 also by Paul Brown where he's saying, oh, I don't want to leave. I love the woman on this leave. I don't want to leave. Which is so annoying. There's the Don Quixote one where the leading lady was his own piano teacher who he was in love with, and he actually goes to bed with her when she thinks it's somebody else, which is extremely unethical. And then there's another one where there's a psychic woman who knows who Sam is and sees him as himself, and that's the same basic story. I love her and I don't want to leave, but then of course he does, and we go, oh god, that one's over, and I'm watching that again.
Sam doesn't need to have an older brother who died in Vietnam to care about Vietnam. Sam was born on the 8th of August 1953. Vietnam was all over his childhood and young adulthood. He knows all about it and why it was terrible, because he has to have older brother Tom died in Vietnam to anchor him to it personally, which really is a mistake. And it's obvious in season 1 that they haven't thought of Tom. They can get away with it by introducing him into the whole concept in season 2. Sam can suddenly remember, I have an older brother. And Al can be like, yeah, your Swiss cheese memory forgot him for a while. But of course, in season 1, in the second half of the pilot episode, where Sam phones his own dad, and his dad mentions during the conversation, I call my boy Sam, he'd have said, my younger boy, wouldn't he really? The thing I think they take too far with Al is Beth. It would be plenty to know that Al was a seasoned naval veteran and had been a prisoner of war in Vietnam and had a very colourful, interesting, but at times traumatic life. But of course they have to have the whole thing that, well, he's been married 5 times and he's now with another long-term girlfriend, Tina, because his first wife, Beth, was the only woman he ever truly loved and she'd given him up for dead and remarried. And when that's driving Al's character and motivation, particularly at the end of season 2 in the episode all about Beth, and Al trying to manipulate Sam into making her not remarry instead of doing the proper leap, those aren't very good moments for Al, in my opinion. I don't really like all the Beth stuff. And of course we realised this time watching the DVD, certainly in season 2, Beth didn't really like Al and want him to come back. I hadn't realised before just how quickly she'd had the Navy declare him dead before the end of the Vietnam War, before they'd even had a look to see if there were any prisoners of war left. But Beth had met this other man in 1969 and brushed off and said to the Navy, oh, declare my husband dead, I want to marry this other man. She was saying to Sam, wasn't she, how she kind of wanted to divorce Al before, but he was about to go to war. And she said, oh, you don't divorce a man who's about to go off to war, do you? She'd been hoping all the time that he wasn't going to come back, and she made damn sure as soon as she could that, in legal terms, he hadn't come back to her.
And it's a very peculiar artistic choice by Donald P. Belisario. There's a scene at the end of the episode which I think is supposed to be very moving, but it just doesn't really make sense that Al is speaking to Beth, who can't see or hear him, and saying, I'm alive out there, Beth. Our love is the only thing keeping me going. And we're thinking, she doesn't love you, though. And they're doing this dance where she's dancing around the room on her own, pretending Al's there. I doubt it, but he actually is there in the form of a hologram. So that's all very, very peculiar. And then in the final episode, which is also nonsense, Donald seems to have forgotten that he implied or even explicitly stated that Beth wasn't very keen on Al, and she's happy to hear from Sam. Al's alive and he's coming home. The two things, the 2 episodes, don't fit together at all.
But at least Al gets his 4 daughters out of it anyway. And of course, Al cares so much about Jimmy, the Down syndrome, retarded Leapy, because he had a sister, Trudy, who was neglected in a home because she was, as they might have said at the time, retarded. And it's implied they neglected her so much that she kind of starved to death, and they put it down as she died of some kind of illness. And Dean Stockwell makes it very clear that Al doesn't believe that it was really an illness that killed her, but they just didn't care about her and she starved to death. And then later in season 5, when we come back to Jimmy, Al stating, oh, Trudy died of this illness as a fact. The script there certainly doesn't agree with probably the script of the season 2 episode, and certainly the way that Dean interpreted it. Speaking of leapies, it was really striking me this time how Sam's string theory about leaping back and forth within your own lifetime doesn't have anything to do with leaping back in your own lifetime and replacing other people who then come forward in time and replace you. You were saying how it really directly contradicts the string theory to have some of them leap into the late 90s, which is definitely outside their own lifetime for some of the leapies. Particular ones I could think of as examples were Elvis Presley and Lee Harvey Oswald, but there are others. The string theory only relates to the person who starts doing the leaping. So one thing that the confusing, silly final episode might improve on is that Sam is now going to leave around in time being himself, which probably really, with the sci-fi we're presented in the show with the string theory, makes more sense, as much as time travel makes sense to anyone, which is a very subjective thing anyway.
I would like to go through some of the other mistakes that you can see in many episodes. I think the big one, and in a way the others might all stem from it, is when they don't tell you what happened originally. It was particularly disappointing this time around to remember and fully realise that the bigamy episode is one of those. It's a good episode where Sam's leapt into a bigamist and he's got two families, and it's quite amusing seeing him really doing the work of this bigamist, trying to keep the wives apart, and Al saying, "Oh, you're here to choose which is the best wife for him," and we're saying, well, what happened originally? His younger family, the, as far as we know, second woman that he married, although a third one comes along at the end, has come to surprise him at his original home, which she thinks is a business trip. What happened? Get Ziggy to see if Marty, I think is his name, was prosecuted, or either of them divorced him or didn't divorce him and had to stay married to him, being mucked about. There's just absolutely nothing. They don't even ask Ziggy.
Some scenes don't fit in with what could possibly have been the original history. If Sam has changed something and things are happening as a result, Sam deals with it. Okay. But sometimes there's a scene and you're like, well, how did they get out of this originally without Sam there doing his jiu-jitsu or some of his other skills, be they physical or mental? The particular example I think of for that is the one with the three singing African-American girls, who doubtless would have been raped and mugged and possibly murdered in the original history when they walked along this street that they were going to have walked along anyway if Sam hadn't been. If the writers don't have the original timeline in mind and make it fit together, that's not good world building.
I happen to remember the writer of that episode is Deborah Pratt, who's married to Donald. She also wrote the Miss Melanie episode, which is the high point for season 1 and really a springboard for what to do right, how to make a Quantum Leap episode. She can do very good ones, and she can do ones with mistakes in. And she also wrote an episode called Black on White on Fire, which is terribly serious and rather harrowing. So for that reason alone, I wouldn't put it on the DVD of our favourites, if we can make such a thing. But then this time around, I really realised Ziggy seems to be actually withholding information to allow the episode to happen. It's about race riots, and Al's on the hand link saying, well, I don't know what you're supposed to do, Ziggy hasn't got anything. And then one of the characters in the episode, the brother of the person Sam has leaped into, is shot dead. And he was going to go out and be in the race riots anyway, so you can't see how Sam being there has affected that. Well, why didn't Ziggy mention it as perhaps what Sam was supposed to fix? And there's this whole thing where the other brother holds Sam's, the Leapy's, white girlfriend hostage. And again, didn't he do that in the first place? If not, why not? Sam really doesn't seem to have affected this, and why didn't Ziggy mention it? At times it seems it's too inconvenient for Sam to have access to information from the future in terms of writing the episode and creating some jeopardy.
It's one of the things that makes Back to the Future such a strong piece of time travel fiction. You can see what the characters have changed by coming back into the past, why it's so significant for the future, and how and why they're going to need to put it back right.
And there are episodes of Quantum Leap that do that very well. The Miss Melanie episode, the one where Sam is the veteran who doesn't have any legs. Ziggy knows perfectly well that Billy, I think his name is, committed suicide by using what little movement he had to drive his wheelchair into the swimming pool. Actually, Ziggy doesn't know that much. She just knows he was found in the swimming pool. But then that one has another problem of Al not checking information properly. he's saying, oh, you have to keep his marriage intact because he goes on to have children. Doesn't bother checking if he has children with that wife or divorces that wife and has them with Jennifer Aniston. And then the other one that's really like that is the episode called Runaway, where Sam is the 13-year-old with a mom who's a bored housewife and wants more out of life and is reading all the feminist literature that's new in the world. And Al just assumes she runs off with this other man who she knew at college when her life was more exciting. He doesn't bother checking if she went and lived with him or near him at a new address, and doesn't bother checking if any body that might be hers was ever found in the general area she disappeared.
Al's worried in the Veteran with No Legs episode there that 2 kids are going to pop out of existence if Sam doesn't do it right. At other times, they have made people in the future pop out of existence through their interventions and not really seem to care about it. I particularly remember the season 3 premiere, The Leap Home, where Sam leaps into himself at 16 years old. By winning the basketball game, he makes it so that Lisa doesn't marry No-Nos. But we've already heard, okay, they didn't have a very happy marriage, but their 2 children, who in the current Sam's own timeline would be in their 20s, they're suddenly going to pop out of existence. It's hard luck on them, isn't it? And No-Nose is very inaptly named. He does have a nose, he's just got a very scarred nose from his farming accident.
Now, talking about The Leap Home, and really also the pilot episode, makes me think about John Beckett, Sam's father. When he gets that phone call in the pilot episode, he's an actor of about the right age, fine. When we see him again in The Leap Home, and another time in an episode where Sam is one of 3 brothers robbing a bank in Elkridge, Indiana, where Sam is from, John Beckett is played by Scott Bakula with aging makeup on and looking rather like Freddy Krueger, which is a pretty bad mistake. And also, to do that, it's just not appropriate, I think. No one else in the Beckett family is played by the same actor, not even when Sam leaps outside his own lifetime into his great-grandfather. Other characters don't play members of their own family, with one exception, and that's the little girl in the Abigail trilogy who plays Abigail and Abigail's daughter when they're about the same age, which is fine, but putting aging makeup on Scott Bakula that makes him look like Freddy Krueger to play his father, I really don't think that's appropriate, unlike in Back to the Future.
Of course, they had back the teenager who played young Sam in the pilot. They should have had back the actor who played the dad to go with him.
They really should. But then that brings us to another mistake, which is dubbing on the voices of Scott and Al to the actors playing the characters younger. Young Sam comes to talk to Dad after the phone call, and it's Scott's voice, and Scott Bakula has the voice of a man in his late 30s as he is, so it doesn't sound right. I don't ever really think that's a good idea, although I must admit, if I haven't already on the Superman podcast, I didn't notice when they did it with Christopher Reeve and the young Clark, because Christopher Reeve is still in his 20s and sounded young, and perhaps even sounded a bit younger than he was. But Scott Bakula doesn't sound 16, and then even worse is to do it with Dean Stockwell, who's in his 50s, and his voice works very well for Al, who's in his 60s, because it's the voice of someone who smokes an awful lot of cigars, as Al does, dubbing this onto a young guy in his 20s. What were they thinking? I don't have the words. And add to that Al's claim that he didn't start smoking until after this period in time, and then add to that that the whole episode is nonsense and has a rushed ending, and you just want to forget the whole thing, really. That is the season 4 finale by Donald. He's getting a right roasting and going on the Olden Days podcast Blacklist. The idea of leaping into a younger Al could be quite interesting, and I think Donald found it so interesting that he forgot to really bother with the plot. Al is accused of raping and murdering the wife of one of his superiors in the Navy. And in the original history, Lisa, his married girlfriend, lover, said Al was with me and he got off the charge. Fine. And then in the episode, Sam thinks, oh, I must be here to prove Bingo's innocence. He doesn't know it's Al yet, without Lisa ruining her reputation, and says, oh no, don't tell them, I'll sort it out some other way. And in both continuities, whether Lisa has spoken up, ruined her reputation, but saved Al, or whether, as far as she knows, the case is about to go to trial, it makes her upset enough to be driving along crying and crashing her car and killing herself. And really, I don't think either of those circumstances is quite as serious as that.
Speaking of Al's naval history, another episode where that's important is the one about the naval college with the gay rights in it, which is quite unusual in Quantum Leap. They don't tend to tackle gay stuff. That's really the main one where they do. And unfortunately, the only lesbians in the show are involved in a jealous murder plot, which isn't a very good lesbian relationship at all. But Al in that one learns and grows as a person initially. He has a problem with gays in the military being in charge of military operations. And by meeting the characters, getting to know and sympathise with the one who's going to kill himself and has to be talked out of it, and the secretly gay captain at the Naval Academy, Al changes his mind and says to Sam, you were right, I was wrong. I'm not always right, I'm wrong. And that's a good example of seeing Al getting emotionally involved and really being a meaningful part of the episode, even though the only character who's been aware of his presence in it is Sam.
Dean also gets to do one of his very, very funny bits in that episode, where this cadet is going to kill himself in order to incriminate the vigilantes who are actually led by a self-hating gay guy. And Al has Gushy put his image into where this character Philip, I think his name is, he's fiddling about on the ceiling. And Al's saying, are you fixing the light there, Philip? And then turns around and looks at his hand link and then does a very amusing double take, turns around and goes, oh my god, realising he's tying up a noose for himself.
As I said earlier, it was the humour from Al that I always used to enjoy, and we still do enjoy very much. The Bounty Hunter episode is very good for that. Al rushing around telling Sam what to do, and Sam's kind of semi-conscious, things like that. I'm sure Dean Stockwell once had a very nice angelic singing voice, particularly when he was a child star, and that smoker's voice you mentioned has rather damaged it, and he does do quite a bit of singing in the show. It sounds very gravelly. I think it works best when he acts as a kind of bass line for Sam's singing, which is one of Sam's Scott Bakula's and Sam's particular skills. Of course, the central relationship, as I said, between Sam and Al is very important to the show. Sometimes they try to go into the history of it a bit. They're almost 20 years apart in age. They haven't known each other forever, been childhood friends, but they've known each other and been good friends a long time. It seems to be pretty certain that they met at MIT, which is the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Al as a naval officer and Sam as a scientist or a science student. And they both claim at one time to have given the other one their big break at MIT, so that wasn't really sorted out and written into a coherent backstory. But I'm very happy with the fact that they met at MIT and are great friends and have been so for about 15 years. Of course, that's one of the more positive aspects of the show, Sam and Al's relationship and the interplay between the characters, and the two actors bring that to life so well. When you were talking about the Butchie episode, it reminded me of a couple of things, one of which is a good aspect of the show that I think makes a particularly successful leap. The other thing it reminded me of was how when we got to season 5, I was saying, well, even the good things they're doing in season 5, they've kind of done them before just as well or better. And I was saying that after the Women's Lib episode in series 5, which kind of strikes new ground in that Sam is someone's wife for a while and is trying to fend off the husband being affectionate to him at the end of the episode, which is quite amusing. But they've really already done better the issues in that one. in the Butchie one. The bored housewife, the old-fashioned husband, the clash there, the opening of the husband's eyes, the changing of things for the better, which is a good, important thing to explore, but just watching the DVDs through, it did seem kind of familiar in season 5, and I think they did do it better in season 3 with the Butchie episode, which is a very good episode, really, because one thing it does have, as I said, is another positive aspect of the show. It was really striking me this time how a rescue is a good way to conclude a leap, as an exciting denouement to really show that Sam has made a big physical change, saved someone's life, and history has been changed for the better in a very stark, striking way. Quantum Leap has a lot of genres in it: drama, comedy, action,
sci-fi,
and an exciting rescue fits in very well to the whole format as a denouement. It's a very good one in that episode, the Butchie episode. Obviously, as you said, Al should have checked earlier and found out that the mother was going to fall off the cliff, and they'd found her skeleton about 6 years before the current timeline. So it ends up being a very close-cut thing with Sam and the older sister and the dad all working together with the rope to dangle off the cliff and save the mom. And I'm sure nobody watching the episode thought that mom was going to fall off the cliff, but it was a very good, exciting denouement anyway. The first episode I ever saw, which comes midway through season 2, is the first time that Sam leaps into a mom. It's not the first time he's leapt into a woman. That first happens earlier in season 2, in the Samantha episode, and indeed it was the kind of hook for the next season that they put on the end of season 1. Oh, look, he's going to be a woman, even though it's actually about 4 episodes into season 2. But yes, this first one I ever saw, it's the second time he's a woman, and it's the first time he leaps into the 80s, actually, and he has these 3 children, and they discover from the youngest one, the children 5 and under can see Sam and Al, which is incorporated into various episodes in various ways, and it's always interesting to come back and explore that point. And when we were watching that episode this time, Another Mother, I was really picking apart some of the things that are wrong with it, which is quite a few, but I did always like, and I do still like, the rescue at the end of that episode, which is where Sam has to drive after the dirty van with the horrible, perverted kidnappers inside. They've kidnapped Kevin, the main, really guest star of the episode. He's supposed to be 15 years old, but he obviously is about 25 and looks it. And in the original history, he was kidnapped and never heard of again. So Sam has to drive after this van, honking and flashing the lights, and when he's getting out of the car, the kidnappers are like, oh, it's only a woman, and then Sam's knocking them out with his jiu-jitsu and rescuing Kevin, who's all done up with duct tape and things. Kevin's like, whoa, Mom, what have you done? You've knocked out these 2 tough men. Really works as a denouement, and I think was a big part of what hooked me on the series.
In the lead up to that rescue scene, Al does another one of those very heartfelt, believable little sequences where he's really invested in what happens to the character. One of the pervy kidnappers is climbing into the back of the van to fiddle about with Kevin, and Al's there keeping an eye on things, and he says to this guy who can't hear him, you lay a finger on this kid, I'll kill you. I don't know how, but I'll kill you. And I always think Dean puts a lot of conviction into that and really helps us, the audience, to invest in what happens to the character. For a lot of that episode, also, he's bonding with Teresa, the little girl, who's played by Troyan Belisario, the daughter of Donald and Deborah. And that's quite compelling, too, and she's the first child he interacts with on a leap, and he starts trying to tell Sam, I never really thought I wanted kids, and then, of course, Sam has to interrupt and say we need to rescue Kevin. And when Al does talk to children after that, it's always a girl, I think. There are a couple of little boys in the church that Al has to go and warn is going to be attacked by the Ku Klux Klan. And they're going, oh, who is it? What is it? It's a ghost. It's an angel. And one of them says, it's Abraham Lincoln, which is a bit I find amusing. But the children he talks to in a personal one-to-one kind of conversation are this Teresa and the little girl in the bigamy episode and a little girl in the church where he needs to help the lawyer find the bullet that brings this whole court case together.
That episode, Another Mother, is where I got a couple of angels. The character Teresa comes to terms with the fact that Sam and Al are a couple of angels who come to help by replacing Marmee for a few days, which in many ways is true.
And Teresa rather likes Sam as well, and her older siblings think it very strange that she keeps calling their mother Sam, and that kind of thing. It's very humorous and engaging. We've praised Dean Stockwell a lot and Scott Bakula a bit. Of course, Scott Bakula is very good too. He can do all sorts of things, such as sing, and he tells us in these little segments on the DVD that he can play certain instruments and certain sports. And of course, Sam can do things that perhaps Scott can't, such as be a doctor and invent time travel. And Scott is also a very, very, very good actor, and one of the things he does very well is wear stupid clothes. I think his whole demeanour when he's got certain clothes on, like women's clothes, is a mix of feeling a bit awkward and uncomfortable, but also clearly trying to fit in with the role and convince people that he's the leapy that they're seeing, which is very clever.
Yeah, you always feel that the characters are talking to the person that they think Sam is.
Of course, another mistake that is made sometimes is that the script doesn't really allow for that. Sam is just there with these people and they're calling him Patrick or Billy or something, but that person doesn't really have a life or a particular connection with the characters that Sam wouldn't have as himself. The main one I remember is where he's one of a comedy trio. That character could just be anybody and it is just Sam.
Yeah, it's a lot better if you can envision the character in the universe when Sam isn't there, and often, you can't. The Bombshells are one. He's there as the kind of Uncle Eduardo character, and the nuclear family could be getting along just as well. It wouldn't affect the dynamics of the episode, really, if that character didn't exist. The other thing that was really striking me about Al is, during his long and colourful life, he's had a lot of experiences, picked up a lot of skills and knowledge, and he gets to use this weekly to help Sam in various situations, and indeed they start being quite meta about it. Sam's like, oh, you can do this too, can you? I suppose you learned that at the orphanage. But he's had quite a lot of places where he's learned things, including the orphanage and the navy and the circus.
He ran away to the circus from the orphanage, and also whilst he was running away from the orphanage he learnt how to play pool to a pretty expert level.
And I was thinking it's a bit of a shame we don't get to see Al using his skills and experience himself when we get the opportunity. Obviously, most of the time he's a hologram. He has to do it vicariously through Sam. He doesn't find this frustrating like Rimmer does in Red Dwarf, because Al does have his own physical presence back in his own time. And those bits are rather anomalous where Al turns up saying, oh, look at that pie, I wish I could taste it, like Rimmer would. But I say, well, Al, if you want pie, just have some when you finish doing this bit of the leap. But then sometimes we do get opportunities for Al to actually use his skills himself, like when they swap as Leaper at the start of season 4. Now Al's going to kick Clifford's butt, which is an amusing way he sums up of what he might be there, what his mission is to do. I think I'm here to kick Clifford's butt. And it's not such a bad guess, really, because Sam is often there to kick someone's butt, and it does a lot of good in a lot of cases. But the way Al does this is using Sam's flying kick. Their minds have merged, and Al uses one of Sam's skills to kick Clifford's butt instead of one of his own.
And a clearly much younger stuntman to help.
All Al really does in that episode as Al, something Al would do, is have sex with the woman in the car. Sam will usually, quite correctly, shy away from having it off with people who don't know who he really is. Al is less scrupulous about that. And I think it's a shame, really, that situation of them swapping places doesn't last longer. I like the bit for a change where Al's doing the leap and Sam gets his own hand link and comes through the door and bees the hologram. I think that's rather fun. But that setup only happens for a scene and then they want to get right back to the real status quo. In season 5, Al does get to do a couple of things physically. He gets to rough up Lee Harvey Oswald a bit and shove a gun in his face, which I think Al quite enjoyed doing. And of course we could tell he was very emotionally invested in thinking that it was wrong of Lee Harvey Oswald to shoot JFK.
Although the episode is horrendous.
And then later in season 5, which is also quite horrendous as a setup, Al has to chase the VP through the desert in Los Angeles after the VP, who is a mad gunman, escapes. And it looks for a while like Al's not really going to get to use any of his skills there. He puts on a bulletproof vest, which is a very good idea, as he says to the prostitute, never chase a psycho killer without one, which I think is very good advice. But at the end of the episode, Al does at last get to demonstrate some of his skill by tranking the mad gunman in the neck from quite a distance, which he's proud of as a feat, and I think rightly so.
Of course, most of the time, what Sam can't do, Al can tell him how to do. In season 1, Al tells him some Italian to speak, which it later turns out is about the only language Sam can't speak. He knows French and Spanish, so he probably would have got by okay with the Italians. That's another episode that really exemplifies a mistake that they sometimes make, but they stop making this one. It's really a season 1 thing, which is having a sort of genre piece. That's the Mafia, Goodfellas, Godfather kind of episode. I mentioned the Grease car race one, and there's the film noir, just like in The Incredible Hulk, a mistake they only make once. Of course, one of the hooks, one of the things you tune in to see every week, is Sam leaping into the new situation, and whatever it is, God or fate or time leaping him around, likes to have a laugh and put him into the most awkward situations. He'll find himself having to perform a magic trick in front of an audience on the spur of the moment is one that comes to mind, although overall that is a very forgettable episode. And of course he'll leap into the middle of a boxing ring, or an aeroplane that he's supposed to be piloting, or something like that. One that I do remember that I hadn't really retained, and we both found very funny this time around, was the beginning of the psychic episode. And as you said, it was the only thing worth putting in that whole disc for, where he's seconds away from giving a television report about a murder, and a murder's not funny, really, is it? And someone's asking him, can you tell us what's happening here? So Sam says things like, well, I'm in a building, and there's a cop at the end of the hallway, and partly it's funny because it rings true. That's what the news is like a lot of the time.
We spotted, particularly this time, how it takes them a while to realise that they need to cut off the intro, the hook for the next episode, with Sam saying, oh boy. And we very much understand why he's saying, oh boy, and wonder how he's going to move on to the next bit of the episode.
They do sort that out, and another thing that they do early on is they have a recap of the previous episode, which is so unnecessary. It doesn't matter what he did on the last sleep, it only matters what he's going to do on this sleep. It seems they went to a lot of trouble for far too long, really, to get Scott to read something out that was always different, but basically along the lines of quantum leaping is very difficult, but it's nice when you stop someone marrying an abusive, violent jerk, or it's nice when you bring a family back together, whatever. And I guess one day they decided they either couldn't be bothered with that anymore, or it wasn't necessary. And I think anyone who knows Quantum Leap and enjoyed Quantum Leap can probably remember roughly, if not word for word, the introduction to each episode that's read out by Deborah.
Which is in seasons 3 to 5. They've sorted out how they want to start the show.
And it is a condensed version of one they try out in season 2, which is much too detailed, under pressure to prove his theories. But it really doesn't matter. All you need to know is that Dr. Sam Beckett stepped into the Quantum Leap accelerator and vanished, and awoke to find himself trapped in the past.
And speaking of Scott doing the voiceovers, throughout, some episodes are over-narrated. Some writers put silly bits of narration for Sam to say over driving scenes and so on. A little bit of narration here and there, yeah, okay. But it's really striking and off-putting when he's narrating too much and getting too lyrical about it. That may have been one of the things Chris Rubenthal was guilty of, I think.
I was interested to see that some episodes of his had potential, have some good bits, some of them are even mostly fine, but certainly over narration. You can spot a Chris Rubenthal episode when Sam will start saying something like, quantum leaping is like being a scarecrow, or quantum leaping is like whatever else happens to be in this scene at this point. Chris Rubenthal tries to be too clever and tries to be too funny, and that really is what he brought over to The New Adventures of Superman that made us slag him off so much. So there's another mistake they make, getting Chris Rubenthal involved. But another big one is when you sit down to watch an episode and you find out what's going on, and it makes you think, what's Sam leapt in now for? Why didn't he leap in a week ago to stop this person getting murdered, where there's a cop at the end of the hallway here, and the murderer's had like 4 victims or something, and he's just supposed to save the psychic lady. There's a bit in the music that I find quite memorable. Sam running along dressed up as a priest with a head wound. And that's from an episode in which someone has been murdered, a child who witnessed the murder, a child has been murdered for having witnessed the first murder, and Sam is there to stop the murderer from being run over by a train whilst being held at gunpoint on the railroad tracks by another priest, which makes the episode sound about as stupid as it actually is. And the murderer is actually a young person. I think he's meant to be a teenager, although he's really an adult with a bit of a funny voice. And it turns out he became a murderer because he's got PTSD from finding his father's body after he committed suicide by hanging himself. Well, why not go back in time and stop that? At least stop the child from finding the body. And there are a few like that. That lesbian murder that you mentioned. Why not go back a couple of days earlier and stop her getting murdered in the first place, her and her unborn baby?
It's in the Abigail trilogy episode where Sam's narration as he leaps in says, I'm finding myself thinking what I often think when I turn up with a dead body. Why am I too late? Which is a very good question, which the writers can't really answer.
One I always did remember was Danny and the Jewish family. All their problems are as a result of their grief at the death of Danny, their son/older brother, who died in a plane crash, I believe, along with some other people.
So God or fate or time or whatever is very capricious about who Sam is allowed to save and how. And hopefully, after the final episode, when Sam seems to gain control of his own leaving, he can go back to some places and sort things out at a better time, so he wouldn't have been too late.
There's really been a lot of negativity, hasn't there? But then those higher peaks I talked about certainly are there. My favourite episode, I was very surprised to see, was written by Paul Brown, the one I was slagging off big time earlier. And that's the one where Sam leaps into the life of a chimpanzee on the space program. And really I like it because it's got all the right ingredients and none of the mistakes. They're invested in the characters. Sam and Al care what happens to the chimpanzees and to the chimpanzee research lady. And it's got a lot of humour from Sam being a chimpanzee. And we know what happened and what he's there to stop, which is Bobo the chimpanzee being killed by massive head trauma when a scientist who's not actually evil but not as understanding of chimpanzees is experimenting with space helmets by whacking chimpanzees on the head, and they go into why that's a bad idea and why he doesn't think it is such a bad idea.
He lists all the good things that we owe to primate research, like the iron lung, and while that may be perfectly true, Sam and the young chimp doctor are keen to point out in the episode how the cranial structure of the chimp really tells you nothing about the safety of the helmets with the cranial structure of the human. If it did, would it be more ethical to test crash helmets on chimps?
Another episode I like very much is the beauty pageant one, for very much the same reasons. It's very funny to see Sam participating in a beauty pageant, and it's quite clear who needs help and why. Carney, the young, innocent, wide-eyed country girl who's supposed to be 19, gets some naked pictures taken that ruin her life. So Sam has to kick the photographer's butt and destroy his film.
I love that bit where Sam dangles the photographer out of the window, and it's particularly good because you know that Carney and the photographer think he's a young girl who's not going to be much use physically against this grown-up man photographer, but surprisingly she is. One I always think of when he's leaped in to kick someone's butt is the raped episode, where very reasonably Sam and Al are working on the assumption that they have to get the trial to find the rapist guilty of rape, and in doing so they help the girl to talk through it by holding on to Al and giving testimony from the imaging chamber. But as it turns out, they weren't there for that at all. The jury still comes back with not guilty because of the time and the circumstances, and it's all terrible, but of course it turns out what Sam is there to do is kick the guy's butt when he tries to rape the girl for a second time and expose the guy as a rapist and a terrible person, and he's going to lose his untouchable status in the small town as a result.
That's another very good bit of acting, very little bit of acting by Dean, I think. Some people might be tempted to think, does a young rape victim really want to be holding onto the arm of an older man? Is he really going to be kind and reassuring? And he is, smiling and telling her, just relax, and then while the character Katie is giving her testimony from the imaging chamber, you can see Dean's face just behind reacting the whole way through, and you can really see how compassionate Al feels about the situation.
Dean does some very good face work and reacting to Sam's emotions in the leap home. It makes Al think of what it would be like to go back in time and interact with his own family and how much pain he feels about his past. Sam's having his whiny moment. He wants to save his brother Tom, which he manages to do in the end, and he wants to save his dad from having a heart attack, which we don't know if he manages to do. And he's whining about, why can't I be here to help them? I've saved all these people. Why can't I save the people I love? It's not fair. And Al gives him a stern talking to. I think it's damn fair. If I had the chance to have a Thanksgiving meal with my dad and my sister, I'd give anything for that. And here you are with that chance, so stop whining about it.
It's one of those Donald written season openers with some problems, but it's also got some interesting things in it. I think both part 1 and part 2, which is when Sam's in Vietnam saving Tom's life. And I suppose people might feel very differently about whether they like, and it's all thanks to you, little brother, at the end, just before he leaps. I think that actually makes a lot of sense following on from part 1, where Sam's been a bit silly, really, and said, I've come from the future and I know what's going to happen and Tom's going to die in Nam.
Yes, it makes perfect sense that after the 2 leaps, Tom has worked out that it is in fact true. Sam has come back in time. And that's one thing that would have been good to see Sam go home and talk to his family about the whole thing, especially Tom. But of course they weren't going to let us see that on the screen. All these people who make these shows are such bet hedgers, don't finish the shows properly, but try and keep us interested in case they get commissioned for a new series or a new special. I like the bit in the Leap Home part 1 where Sam's got the guitar and he's singing to Katie and telling her about the Beatles. I think Katie plays that scene very well. You can very much believe she believes that Sam is 16 and gradually comes to believe him more than she really wants to about what he's saying about the future during the course of the scene. I like the bit where she's asking about John Lennon and you can tell Sam's about to say, oh, he's going to get shot. You hear Al behind him saying, don't tell her, because he knows and we know that Sam's gone rather too far.
Really, telling her that would be the same thing he's already doing, not changing their future, but making their present miserable by saying Tom's going to die in Nam and Katie's going to marry a wife beater.
Yes, I really think in the new history, after everything that happened, that Katie may well not have married Chuck.
This reminds me of another mistake that sometimes gets made, thinking about how things happen one way and Sam changes them, which means it's very, very annoying to say things like Sam gave Buddy Holly the idea to write Peggy Sue, and Sam did the Heimlich maneuver on someone who turned out to be Dr. Heimlich, and Sam showed Chubby Checker the twist.
Even if they're going to create the world we know, and it was different in their past, like originally Jackie Kennedy was assassinated too, and now she hasn't been, they can get away with that, although I don't like it very much. But they shouldn't be creating the future that they themselves already clearly know. It's not an appropriate piece of sci-fi time travel for predestination paradoxes. The other big one of those, of course, is Sam telling his string theory to Captain Galaxy, which is a memorable episode and one that gets referenced again in the final episode. And then Captain Galaxy passing on that string theory to 4-year-old Sam Beckett from Elkridge, Indiana, who enjoys watching his show.
At a time when in the original history he was dead, so he wouldn't have even been able to show his own straight line string theory the first time.
I think they should have left that, as it was a theory that Sam and his professor, who owned the cabin in the mountains, where Sam and the woman who was going to get killed hid for a bit in one episode, developed that together, the string theory. But of course now it was implanted in Sam's mind when he was 4 years old by Captain Galaxy, who got it from Sam himself.
So again, we're back into the negative. There are mistakes and mistakes and mistakes, aren't there, in this show? I keep remembering other episodes where you really can't work out what the hell happened the first time, particularly the great-grandfather episode. It's not as if without Sam there they didn't meet and fall in love and get married, and if Sam helped the runaway slaves to get to freedom, and before they were caught and killed, and the black servant Isaac who helped Mild Livy, then how did Martin Luther King ever get born, because it turns out Isaac is his ancestor?
Yes, again, they were creating the world they already knew there.
Let's remember some more episodes we do like. You mentioned the one with the bounty hunter. Well, Sam is the bounty hunter. That one's good because you know what went wrong the first time. The woman who he's bounty hunting was killed, and also it's not what it seems, which is difficult to do in Quantum Leap, and they can't always get away with, because Ziggy generally knows what's what, the official records reflect what's what, but this one involved corrupt sheriff's department who were helping the ex-boyfriend who was embezzling money to kill the woman. So it's got a good plot, and it's also got some good humour and some good action and rescuing by Sam. Al is counting down to this woman's death. I think her name is Diane. She's going to die in 6 seconds. 5, 4, etc. And in like 1 second, Sam leaps on the bad guy with the gun. And you so do I, but you like it more than I do. I think the episode called Sea Bride.
That has a good denouement, one of the bits where Sam's in some trouble, crawling about in the garbage, about to get dumped into the sea, and Al's encouraging him to get out of the problem, making it sound a lot easier than it is. Grab that umbrella, grab that chain. And really, that's a rescue. He's rescuing the woman from the unhappy marriage to the new person. A shameless, deliberate parody, homage piece, I suppose, of high society there, down to the little sister who's rooting for the woman and her original husband.
Once I got into Quantum Leap, I think I enjoyed each episode about the same, but I couldn't get into it at first. I tried watching it at the beginning of season 3, and of course that's The Leap Home, and my goodness was I confused. Sam was at home with his own mother and father and brother and sister, and they were all calling him Sam, and he knew where everything was and who everyone was. I didn't really get that they thought he was 16. I just didn't get it at all. And then I seem to remember I tried it again the following week, hoping to get a better idea of what it was all about, which was, of course, The Leap Home Part 2, and Sam was in Vietnam. As a child, I found that boring, so at that point I gave up on it. when I did get into it was Miss Deep South, which we've already mentioned as being one of the very good episodes, and I think I had to watch that one or go off on my own and amuse myself because we were on holiday in a guest house. And I got it. Everyone thought that Sam was a young woman who'd entered the beauty pageant. And we all laughed like drains when a previous winner who sort of looks after the contestants is telling him that he walks like a man, and she demonstrates you have to step and glide and step and glide and glide and step, and we thought that was so funny and often quoted it. So after that, I understood Quantum Leap, more or less, and I used to watch and enjoy it. Earlier on, Jake mentioned that Al as a hologram was rather confusing. I really didn't know that he was alive and in the future. I don't think I really listened to Deborah talking about an observer from his own time who appears in the form of a hologram. And having seen Red Dwarf, I really thought a hologram was a kind of ghost. I didn't understand how Rimmer's hologram worked either. But at some stage I got the hang of that. But then the other confusing thing was the way that our mum would talk about the pilot episode. And for quite a long time, I think, I thought that just meant the episode in which Sam is a pilot, because his first leap is a test pilot, and people would say the pilot episode of Quantum Leap, and I'd be like, oh yes, that one where he's a pilot. And then one day, I don't know which program they were talking about, somebody said the pilot episode of something else, and I thought, no pilot in that. So it's taken a while to come to terms with what Quantum Leap is all about. I think I was a teenager when I understood it all, but then it's taken until I got the DVD set to really work out what's right with it and what's wrong with it, and how the ratio of wrong to right really isn't what I thought.
One thing it's impossible not to notice, even when you're quite young, is that mostly the episodes are set in the 1960s or 1950s. I think Sam's string, to fit in with his string theory, is mostly bundled up with the first kind of 20 years of his life, and the second half of his life is kind of sticking out and doesn't get to meet the first half very often when he leaps. Of course, this is because it's written by writers who were growing up in the 50s and 60s like Sam and are interested in things like Vietnam. It's very much like if we wrote a show about someone who was in his 40s now. We'd want to set the episodes mostly in the 1990s and some in the late 80s.
I'd certainly set some in the early noughties.
And indeed, there are more 1970s episodes than 1980s ones, and they struggle to use the 1980s, really. A lot of the 1980s stuff is rather dumped stuff. Ever since I found out that two of the early leaps were actually before Sam's birthday in 1953, one of them's 4 days before he was born, and there's one where he's in April 1953, that has annoyed me. And it's not like they don't know his birthday in the pilot episode, because he writes it on the medical form as August 8th, 1953, and that's what they stick with later. So they should have had that very clearly ingrained as the furthest back he could have gone. Of course, Sam was in utero in those two episodes that are set before he was born, so you can use that as an excuse. But then you'd think if that counted, he'd have sometimes been back to the very end of 1952, or at least had one more leave earlier in 1953. So that's the sort of thing, once you've watched the show a few times, you can really pick apart and object to.
In that last episode, which is really nonsense, and he's very complicatedly leaped on the day of his birth, really indicates that they didn't mean that he could leap into before his birthday.
I was saying earlier how Season 5 really struggles for ideas and tries new things, not always very successfully. Trying to bring in aliens and vampires, the real people leaps with Dr. Ruth, where Sam is Dr. Ruth. Lee Harvey Oswald is the Season 5 premiere, where he is Lee Harvey Oswald. The Elvis Presley leap, where he is Elvis Presley. That's funny. Scott Bakula banging on the door of the music studio going, hey, it's me, Elvis Presley.
That would be very funny out of context.
And the Marilyn Monroe episode, where he isn't Marilyn Monroe herself, but he's her bodyguard. And in that one, he's creating the universe we know, but they don't, saving Marilyn Monroe to still be alive for a couple of years, but she can make the Misfits.
No way should he have leapt into Elvis Presley in the days when he was doing his first auditions and getting discovered. Sam, in real life, if it were real, would have mucked it up for him, missing auditions, getting him audition with this woman who he's supposed to be helping, ambushing the record producer in the diner. It's all ridiculous nonsense, and there were plenty of other people who could have helped the young woman not to marry the jerk. But then there are times when he really doesn't leap into the most appropriate person. Leaping into Lee Harvey Oswald was absolutely no help.
Yes, in the end, he had to leap into the bodyguard who'd saved Jackie.
And in the meantime, there are a lot of scenes which are complete nonsense, including one in which Al is telling Sam to cut his wrists, because that's what Lee Harvey Oswald did.
And the other big new thing they try, all within season 5, is the evil leaper. And I was saying that was like the time vandals from Time Busters, which is true. Because Aaliyah, the evil leaper, although she's really kind of trapped and misguided, turns out, of course, she's not evil herself, specifically goes back in time to put wrong what once went right. And even in her premiere, she's gone back to re-put wrong what Sam has already put right with Jimmy and Frank in the season 2 episode.
Aaliyah and her hologram Zoe are well cast. I find them both quite compelling and good in the parts. I think they could have done basically the same idea, Jack from True Calling kind of a thing, with those actors and the same basic stories would have been quite a good idea. Now, what Jack in True Calling does is try to stop True from basically doing what Sam does, saving people's lives after travelling back in time. Not quite so far in her case, but he's preserving fate. And I think it would be an interesting idea for Aaliyah to have the assignment of preserving fate. Zoe's into it, she rather likes being evil, and Aaliyah's not into it and wants to get out of it. And I think they could have done those things as they did, but done them better. The trouble is that they're from actual hell. Their Ziggy, which is called Lothos, is really a computer form of Satan himself, which I think is overstating it, and which I think isn't sci-fi enough. Why not say that they're a project that followed Sam's work from the not-too-distant future, and Aaliyah ended up in this situation where, in order to leap and hope each time that the next leap will be the leap home, was to reinstate fate, undo what Sam has done. I think that would have worked very well, and they could have had those same episodes where Sam leaps back into Jimmy and Aaliyah is Connie, and it would work to rip herself up and say Jimmy tried to rape her if she's trying to get him institutionalized, which was what Sam put right in the first place, so you wouldn't have to lose that very striking scene and then see her again, okay, at the college with the hazing. I think the next episode in the women's prison is more interesting, although again there's problems with it. They're very, very sure that if Sam bundles Aaliyah out of this car that's about to drive over the cliff, they'll leap together, and guess what, it works. But then you get Zoe leaping as well to try and sort Aaliyah out. And they're also, aren't they, trying to solve the mystery of the in-prison murder. And there's another problem with the episode. It's all suddenly solved right at the end, and the solution's rather obvious. And I actually thought of a better one, where the murderer was the woman who seemed to be nice, but actually she was nice.
They have a good name for their evil waiting room in that episode, don't they? The holding chamber.
Yes, I like that.
It would be so easy to say they were from like 10 years in the future doing a Quantum Leap project, and the 60s with Frank and Jimmy is as far back as Aaliyah could leap, because that's when she was born. And you can't present that as a theory because they have her in the 50s in the college one. So overall, a bit of a wasted opportunity to do it really well, but plenty of potential and aspects of it to enjoy.
Really made me think the most annoying, frustrating thing is unrealised potential.
And doubtless, Aaliyah is one idea that would have been come back to if The show had continued it anyway, but the show didn't come back after that annoying season finale, end of season 5 episode that posed more questions than it answered, and they cut the end bits with Al and Beth back together, making some attempt to explain that Sam was still himself and they were trying to locate him in time. They just flash up the message, "He never made it home," and we're like, oh well, that's the ending, is it? We're just supposed to accept that. And on that note, this podcast too comes to an end. Hopefully you'll join us again next time, which will be the final Sunday in October, for a podcast on
a couple of adaptations of Lewis Carroll's Alice books.
Until then, good night out there.
Whatever you are.